Hi, and welcome back. Now that the third quarter has ended, I thought this would be a good time to do a recap of what I've spent so far for 9 months of full-time travel. First, I'll give a quick recap of where I was, and then I'll go over each category one by one, giving a little bit more detail on some of the ones that are more costly. And after that, I will also break it down to a certain extent per quarter so that you can see how much the costs for things are in each region that I was in. So it ended up being kind of clean because the regions I was in ended up kind of being in each quarter. So each quarter will be in a different region, which kind of makes sense to break it down financially that way as well. So if you're new here, my name is Kyria, and I'm an avid traveler who retired early last year to pursue a life of full-time travel and adventure. So let's get started. So the first thing I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about where I was. So in the first quarter, I mainly was in Western Europe. And if you haven't already seen, I did break down the first 3 months costs, and that I will link here and also put down in the description below. But essentially I was in Germany, France, Poland, Amsterdam, Brussels, and Spain. So the second quarter I spent in a combination of Türkiye, Georgia, and Armenia. And then for the third quarter, I spent most of the time there in either the Baltics or the Balkans. At the end, like I said, I will break down a little bit more the cost per day and accommodation cost per day in each region so that you can get a better idea of how much each region costs in the long run. So the first thing we always talk about is accommodation. This is the most expensive thing, and actually I did do a breakdown, and accommodation is essentially 50% of my travel cost. So that's a lot. But before I give you the number for the accommodation, let me give you kind of an idea of how my accommodation was broken up, because this does matter. This period that I'm going to be talking about is 276 days. So I know 3 quarters is 270 days, but since it worked out per region, I am just using all the days. So 276 days, and 111 of them were spent in Airbnbs. 111 of them, it's kind of weird, right, was spent in places booked on booking.com. 19 of them were spent in either a private guest house or B&B kind of thing. 23 nights were spent camping, and 12 nights were spent in hotels. So my total that I spent for accommodation over this period was $9,920. This breaks out to about $36 per day, which actually works out pretty well. But like I said, I did spend 23 days camping, which cost me nothing. And the 12 days that I spent in a hotel, only 2 of them I actually paid for. The rest were booked using points. And the Airbnbs are actually one of the cheapest options, since usually they're booked for a longer period of time. So usually if I'm going to be staying for 30 days or 28 days or more, I'll book an Airbnb or a booking long-term stay. If I'm going to be staying for a week or just a few days, I'll often use booking.com for those reservations, or I'll use a hotel stay. So it kind of does make sense that the fact that a lot more of the bookings are on Airbnb, and that drives the cost a little bit lower. So the average cost for an Airbnb per night for this period for me was about $35. For booking, it's about $45. For the guest house B&B, it's about $47. And then the hotels, like I said, I only had to pay for 2 nights, so it doesn't really make sense. But those were about $75 a night versus the other ones were all free. So that's kind of how the accommodation broke down. Like I said, in the end, I'll break it down a little bit more by region. So let's move on to dining out. For dining out, I spent $1,912. And for groceries, I spent $1,375. The 2 of these together come out to about $12 a day. But again, in the end, I'll talk to you a little bit more about how much the food costs in each different place. And just so you have some clarity on kind of what my habits are, I usually go out to eat dinner maybe once a week and lunch maybe once a week. And other than that, I might have a beer or a glass of wine here or there, but I'm not really a huge dining out person. So I'm not going out to eat every single day. And then for groceries, I often cook at home, less meat. So if I eat out, I'll eat meat. But if I don't eat out, then at home, I don't cook a lot of meat. So it often is a lot of vegetables. So that will kind of give you an idea of the fact that if you're going to eat a lot of meat, or if you're going to go out to eat a lot, your dining out costs or grocery costs might be a lot higher. For entertainment, I spent $1,042. And most of this usually consists of walking tours, any other kind of excursions, and sometimes bike rentals, things like that. For miscellaneous, I spent $600. And I mentioned this in my Georgia video, but this was for some documents I had to send home mostly. I spent about $300 on getting some documents notarized and sending them home. So this obviously is not a cost that most people would incur, but that went under miscellaneous, which is why my miscellaneous category is so high, because otherwise miscellaneous usually is the cost for postcards and stamps and bathroom fees. So those are really minimal costs. For transportation, I spent $1,304. This does not include any flights. I'm not going to include the flights in this wrap up. That will be in my wrap up at the end of the year. $1,304 mostly was getting from point A to point B, mainly between cities, so buses and trains and things like that. And then of course, public transportation in any of the cities where I was in, or day trips that I took public transportation for. I also did rent a car when I was in Spain, so that is included in the transportation category, but the bulk of this category is going to be overland travel from one place to another. For health, I spent $1,080. This includes my monthly insurance premium. And this premium, I was paying about $250 using Cigna Silver, and that was ended in March. So for January through March, that was a little bit higher per month charge. But then since then, usually it's running me, let's say around $80 a month, because it is in euros, so that fluctuates depending on the month, but the average is around $80 a month. And what I do usually is I prorate this out and I add it to any visit per visit, depending on the amount of days. I also did go to the dentist, and that cost about $62, and that was when I was in Georgia for a cleaning. For utilities, I spent $1,105. This includes my credit card fees, any kind of subscriptions for cloud storage or like NordVPN, for instance, so computer security. I also have a subscription for a satellite messenger SOS security thing, so for when I'm hiking. And I have McAfee for my computer, things like that. That's all, anything that I basically pay for each year. Most of those are yearly, and then I just break them down and prorate them. And in this case, the bulk of the fees is credit card fees, so that was about $725 out of the total. And right now, for a whole year, I'm paying $959 in credit card fees. But if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I am going to do an annual review, which is coming up soon, where I will talk about which cards I'm going to keep and which cards I'm not going to keep, especially since some of them are starting to raise their annual fees. This category also does include phone. I know a lot of people are always wondering about that. And right now I have a 365-day eSIM, which costs me $58 and has 20 gigabytes of data. So there are some countries that aren't covered in this. For instance, Bosnia and Herzegovina was not covered. So there are some countries that you're going to have to buy a supplemental card. So I would say, even including the supplemental cards so far, I've paid about an extra $12 for that. So all in all, about $70 would be for the year, which I'm prorating out. And last but not least, for shopping, I spent $1,315. And this mostly consisted of a new phone I had to buy. I also had to buy an external hard drive to store my videos. And the other big thing was a pair of running shoes. And then other than that, it's just a couple of t-shirts and socks and random things that I've just needed to pick up along the way. So all in all, for the 276 days, which is basically 9 months, I spent $19,655. This breaks out to about $71 per day. Or if you assume every month is 30 days, that would be about $2,136 per month. So I'm basically within budget at the moment, which is great because at the first few months of the year, I was not sure how it was going to go, to be honest. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the first quarter, I was in Western Europe, like I said, and all in all, the per day cost for that region was $81. For the same region, if you look at average cost per night, that was about $44 for accommodation. And then average food cost per day was about $16. The next one for the second quarter, which was 59 days in Türkiye, 34 days in Georgia, and 4 days in Armenia, worked out to be about $58 per day. Average cost of accommodation was about $29, and average cost of food was about $8. So you can see there's a big difference in the accommodation cost and the food cost there. But in most of the cases, the accommodation is essentially 50% of the total daily charge. For the third quarter, I was in the Baltics for about 23 days and the Balkans for about 69 days. And altogether, those places cost me about $68 a day, and the accommodation was about $36 a day. The food cost for those places was about $13 a day. But Don't forget that I did do some camping. So I did about 17 days of camping when I was in Türkiye, and I did about 10 days of camping when I was in the Balkans. And so that does lower the accommodation cost significantly. But even if I paid for accommodation in those two areas, the cost of accommodation would be significantly less than the cost in the Western Europe area. The other thing I wanted to address was, well, what if you're a couple? So I could just basically estimate this, but I would say accommodation is going to be the same because pretty much every place I've had is big enough for two people. So accommodation would be the same. And if you just assume that everything else would basically be doubled, I know that's not exactly going to be accurate. Some things may be a little bit less, but if you're just being conservative and you assume each thing is doubled, total for a couple would come out to about $54 per day per person. So $108 for a couple per day. If you want more information about the Türkiye and Georgia costs, I can link videos for those here and also put them in the description below. And for the third quarter, I'm still working through the destination videos, and I will be going over the cost of those areas in each video. And then once I'm done with all the destination videos, I will go dig a little bit deeper into the details of those specific countries as well. But I did kind of want to point one thing out. There are two main ways you can keep your costs down, and one of those is to stay in less expensive countries. The other one is to stay a longer time. So you can see, if you've watched my video about Latvia, which I'll put here and also link below, but the cost per day in Latvia was about $93. But why was that? Because I only stayed 7 days in Riga. And I think I mentioned in my video before, but I'll say this again, I had booked a place for 1 month and it was $800 for an apartment for 1 month. And when I decided instead of staying there for a month, I was going to only stay for a week and I was going to go do something else instead. And I went to change my reservation. It was basically over $400 for 1 week. So it over doubled in cost because I waited until closer to the date. I had booked the original one about 6 months in advance, and then I had changed it maybe 2 months in advance, and it had already basically doubled. So that's the other thing you can do. I know sometimes you don't know what your plans are going to be, but it definitely does make it a little cheaper if you book it in advance. And what my tip is that you always just make sure it's cancelable. And then if it's cancelable up until a month before the reservation, make sure you set yourself a reminder so that you don't forget to cancel it if you don't want to use it. But booking ahead of time, booking a longer stay, and booking in less expensive places, those three things really will keep your costs down because, like I said, accommodation is 50% of my total every time. I guess I'll leave you with this. So what was my most expensive cost per day? Well, Brussels was the most expensive, and I even booked my hotel with points. But I had some friends with me and I took them out to eat, and we ended up spending about $70 a day on food. So that was the most expensive. And what was the least expensive? Ironically, that was Amsterdam. And that was because I stayed with the same friends that I went to Brussels with, and they let me stay in their apartment. So that would have been a lot more expensive. So even if I took them out to dinner there, it still ended up being the cheapest place because of the accommodation. So accommodation and food, those are your most expensive things. So if you can keep those down, then that really helps a lot. All right, so let me know in the comments, have you been to any of these places and did you find them expensive or not? And what is your average goal for what you want to spend per day, and do you stick to it? And then what's the most expensive place that you've ever been, and how much did you spend per day if you're willing to admit it? All right, well, if this video is helpful, please consider subscribing. And once again, thank you very much for watching, and happy travels.